I hope I can be heard and you can see the screen share. Just shout me if anything goes wrong and you can't. Okay, so you've seen the advertised information. We're looking at inclusion and recommendations and also some examples. And I wanted to start by guiding you to some good sources of information. The most recent one, launched last year and still new, is by Down Syndrome International, International Education Guidelines. And I was fortunate to be helping as one of the co-authors with that. And that looked at all research. Again, there's also a very thorough book looking at teaching and learning with all really interesting chapters, which is there, Educating Learners with Down Syndrome, edited by Rhonda Farracher and Barbara Clark. And then the Alana Inclusive Education report from 2016, which also, thoroughly covered the information at that time. These have lots and lots of information in them. And I bet lots of you have already read all of that information, and I won't be saying anything different. I have highlighted down the bottom, hot off the press, that we have a free webinar on Monday afternoon, 4 p.m. UK time, with an educational psychologist, Sarah Geiger, who has just completed some very interesting research looking at what makes for successful placements, and if people moved, why did they move, what happened, and also a lot of really forward-thinking work with children and young people who have Down syndrome. And some of the people that we have as are working with us through Our Voice have interviewed her, and we'll be talking about that on Monday. And I think she will come out with some new things, and from what she's already told me, there are some positive things for the UK at least. Okay, so DSI International Guidelines, I just want to give you a run through on the structure. So it starts off with key considerations in education. Then there are guidelines for leading. Then there are guidelines for teaching. And then there are guidelines for learning. And each of them has easily accessible recommendations at the end of each section. The key considerations in education at the front covers human rights concepts, and then characteristics of learner and recommendations arising from key considerations in that section. And I'm going to be covering some of those today. But I've put this in bold because although it might seem a bit dry and it might seem a bit far removed away from the classroom, this is the most important thing. If you want successful inclusion, it is your managers, your leaders who know to set it up so that there is shared vision and that teachers have time to plan and work with families and understand and are willing, to be responsible for the learning of everybody in their class, and know and are guiding the work of the teaching assistant. So although I'm not going to be saying much about this today, that really is the most important thing, more important than the practical resources and some of the examples that I'm going to show you. Because with that in place, you can work out, teachers can work out how to do this with parents. And that's also, that's what they cover in their recommendations for teaching. So training, and I'm going to be repeating this a lot, teaching the curriculum for the year group with adjustments to enable engagement with learning outcomes. Where there is an IEP or individual education plan, and not everybody uses one, but where there is one, it must include the team of teachers teaching the child and at least one family member or an advocate and the student, wherever possible, included in the process. And then also some understanding about how to support behaviour. The recommendations for learning section covers all of the ages and transition. So that's detail about moving through life and going into work and adult education and lifelong learning. So it's just to take you through that and for you to know there's lots and lots of information there. Now, coming back to these key considerations, I've got a couple of slides on what they cover of the characteristics and the recommendations arising from those. So characteristics, you're probably familiar with those, and I'll be sharing some information about those too. Recommendations, again, in mainstream classes for their age, withdrawn as infrequently as possible for that child, that situation, that child's needs. Equal right to the whole broad and balanced curriculum, so that it's not based on what someone thinks they might learn or might be useful for them. It's the same as everybody, with high expectations for academic achievement. And teachers made aware of the likely things that may not turn out to be the things they have to adjust for, but just all of that information about learners with Down syndrome gives us advance warning of what is likely, but it's not a definite. Okay, and those are, vision and hearing impairment. Well, these are in the recommendations: speech and language therapy and promotion of speech clarity and fluency, making adjustments for any other additional needs. And I've highlighted autism here, autism spectrum condition or social communication issues, taking account verbal working memory and manipulation of information in working memory, using visual supports. And of course, there's a whole range of those, including written words, and encouraging active movement and participation every way we can. Okay. So now I'm moving on to say things in a bit more detail, or in a slightly different way, with some Down Syndrome Association information. And one of the things that we'd start off with is emphasizing, if we're training teachers right at the beginning, the individual needs. So it's useful to know about learners with Down syndrome, but they can't rely on that. They have to know that individual and to know that everybody with Down syndrome is different in every possible way. And to be confident in their skills as teachers, to get to know that child, that learner, and be able to make those decisions and plan for learning going forward, working with families. There's no off-the-shelf kit for how to do this. You need good teachers. And that's what they do for other children, isn't it? To get to know them really well and then decide on how they're going to teach them. So high expectation, skilled teachers who are able to think about and plan for next steps in learning, and to make it more engaging. Sometimes some of our little ones especially need it to be made a bit more engaging. And the kind of fundamentals of inclusion, that they're welcome and socially included as a member of the whole school. And then we put in additional support, because we do know that additional support has brought about benefits in learning. I've put a slide at the end where we might discuss that a bit more, because people will be different all over, all over the world, all over Europe, as to what types of additional support individuals have. I'm, in the UK, I'm talking about children with one class teacher with about 30 students, and just about all of them would have a high level of additional support available to them, and the communicating across the whole team and including parents. Then emphasizing that they are going to be using, it isn't a specialism in Down syndrome, they're going to be using, it's their framework and knowledge about teaching all children and understanding all children's development. And then the extra bit we might do in the training, you add on to that. It doesn't replace that. And then I've picked out some of the things that that are useful to know to support success, that we might, if we're designing something, set it up so it can be learned by imitation, copying children, or seeing it, or copying adults, or deliberately, whether it's from behavior to learning to color in, or anything at all, have that in your package to set it up that way. And if you are targeting some skills, again, whether it's a behavior or learning not to miss out the number 13 when you're counting, or whatever it is, something you're specifically targeting, and speech skills, you want to do that daily, at least daily. And that's probably something to do with how long-term memory works, because if you do something often, it becomes long-term memory, but that's using. And these are more so than other learners. All of these things are more so than other learners at the same stage of development if you have Down syndrome. But in about planning activities that become routine, what I mean is, don't be too quick, teachers, to think they're not going to manage something or they're not adjusting to a new routine. You know, if you change class or have different staff or the rules change, give them time, because they might not fall into it straight away. But once they realize this is the new routine, they will. So don't be too quick to think we need to go back to letting you play with the baby dolls or something else that you did last year. Stick with it for a while so they get time and to learn the new routine. Knowing how to support positive behaviour and friendships, and then and that's not specific really to people with Down syndrome, and then using their strengths and interests, getting to know those, because you're going to use those. You know, if you know that they have dogs, or they like football, or whatever they like, whatever they do with their families, or whatever TV programs they like or characters they like, you're going to use that in your differentiation to make learning more interesting and engaging as and when you need to. Support relative difficulties, and make sure you share what works well and record what works well in a simple way, so that teachers 2 years down the line can easily find that. So I'd say go for simple records, not for long reports which people won't look at, because sometimes things do pop up again a couple of years later, and it might be different staff, and they'll have forgotten that this actually has happened before, and that you'd all worked out what it was about and you'd all solved it. So some nice, simple, positive records about what works. And you've probably all seen this information before. You know, if you're thinking about the younger children, there's this emerging profile for many of our children with relative strength. So they're further ahead in some things than we might expect them to be, if you see what I mean. And then some specific weaknesses. So a kind of common spiky profile, but it doesn't apply to everybody. Okay. I'll let you read that through. Was there anything? Well, receptive language, particularly vocabulary there. Okay, and relative weaknesses, so things that are more challenging. And as we grow up, thinking about going into school, those relative strengths would be in social skills and understanding, in practical skills and self-help. And then things that are to do with visual spatial memory. So remembering things more easily when presented visually, that learning by imitation, relative strength in reading, and many other visual spatial activities, you know, IT, photography, expressive creative arts, all sorts of things that people genuinely enjoy. It's not just about being good at it, but many people genuinely enjoy them. So we want to let them go fly in anything, but to, you know, certainly let them do that. And then some relative challenges for many around speech and language development, particularly expressive language, and then, you know, health, hearing and vision, memory and cognition, that mean that learning, this verbal short-term and working memory, meaning that learning from listening alone, if it's not supported in other ways, can be difficult, and motor skills. And we use this model, which is a standard model, except I've added a swirly line into it there. That's to remind people that's where all the thinking and planning and problem solving and deciding what to do, deciding what not to do, all of that's going on in working memory. And everybody who has an intellectual disability, you know, will have a bit less of that, or a lot less of that for some people. So thinking of lots of things at once might be hard or overload people. And then the short-term stores of visual spatial, short-term store, and then going into visual spatial working memory. So seeing in things you've seen, thinking in things you've seen and done and experienced, you know, as an easier way of learning and remembering and thinking. getting into long-term memory, and we use long-term memory to feed back into, well, we use long-term memory to understand what's coming in and to use that to guide us as to what we're supposed to do with it all. And then more issues over here with verbal short-term memory and verbal working memory. Okay, I'm moving quite quickly, so I won't go into detail on that, but I would say if we were doing a whole behaviour session, that's really useful to explain how quickly behaviours can be learned, some behaviours can be learned, and how talking about it a lot might not be the solution. You have to focus on doing what you want, you know, what you want to be learned, rather than talking about it too much. Okay. And that's a slide that goes with that. Okay, you know, there's spatial learning, there's more evidence for that actually. So it's visual spatial. And for spatial, you can think of, well, in the classroom, you can think of grids and, well, storyboards. I've got lots of those going through, but yeah, that's visual spatial. Manipulating information and working memory, I've already said about, and I've put a little bit in about attention there, you know, holding, attending for in a sustained way. Some of our little children, you know, they won't be so good at that yet when they're younger. It will get better with age. And some children may have, you know, maybe it may be a little bit more difficult for them. So we would need to make adjustments for that. I've given a quick mention on mental arithmetic and overcoming some of that with visual tools and a calculator, particularly as people get older. And I've said about copying a model and using visual and visual spatial supports, and I'll show you some examples of that. This slide is around that support for attention. And it, you know, may well be necessary for the younger children in particular. Might be necessary for some of the older children too. I guess I want to try and convey that, you know, not being able to sit for very long, or some of the things that we see in classrooms for the younger children would be very common, and they will change, just because sometimes people think the easy time is when they're little and it's going to get more difficult. But I put it the other way around, that, you know, as they learn about school and their attention improves and they know what they're supposed to do, it becomes easier. Now, the differentiation and thinking about how you teach, you might have to put more into that, but actually the student that you have, for me, it's easier as they get older. So that should be very encouraging if any of you have, you know, 4, 5, 6-year-olds and you or teachers are thinking, this is supposed to be the easy time. It isn't supposed to be the easy time. It's going to get better. Okay. You can see them there. You know, if you have a child with weaker attention, you have to go fast. You have to be ready. You have to have things ready to do. And you need to change levels of activities. So easy, hard, noisy, quiet. You have to give physical breaks and move around. You have to have things ready if a planned activity finishes early, and use those visual supports and ICT, and build rewards into a timetable they can see to keep them motivated, and also have space from adult support so they can develop better control of themselves too. Okay, now hearing and vision, we use this illustration to try and show that everybody with Down syndrome, whatever their glasses or conditions, or you know, they're not seeing things as clearly. So we need to make adjustments for that, including writing in black felt pen, not pencil, and thinking about where they're sitting and what they can see, and the clarity of the resources and the size of the resources. So things being big and bold, which for some children can make a big difference. Oh, I don't know how that's written on the slide. That's not me doing that, is it? Sorry. Can you see that? There's a red mark that's appeared. Right. I'm not going to be sharing lots of DSA information, but I have just put in one on vision just to show that we have lots of information. Your organisations probably have lots of information too, that teachers are often interested in, and we make some easier to see writing resources and work with closely with the Down Syndrome Medical Interest Group of UK and Ireland, including health checks, vision checks, hearing checks. And we're also fortunate to have the fantastic Vision Research Centre in Cardiff, led by Margaret Woodhouse, that gives great information to all of us. And I'm not going into detail on hearing, but there's similarly, we have health series information about hearing and management of aids and hearing assessment. And I've put in a few other tips here on, obviously there's management, but there's also thinking about the environment you're sitting in. Is it an environment you can hear in and you can see in? Because you need to be able to see and hear to put together the sounds that you're hearing with what you're seeing. Are you, particularly if you're younger, are you doing activities to use the hearing that you have? And are people getting your visual attention before speaking to you? And then pretty keen on sound field systems, which are where speakers are set up around a classroom and the teacher wears a microphone so that you hear the main voice, the main signal, as clearly as if you were right in front of the teacher. That's what that is, and more of our classrooms are getting those. So very nice for clear hearing, help everybody in the classroom, and speaking clearly but naturally. Sorry, I don't know why that line's bothering me. I think someone else must have put that on there. I don't even know if you can even see it, but there's a mark that's appeared. Not to worry. Then also considering dual diagnosis with autism spectrum condition or disorder, just to be aware of that. What I wouldn't want is for people to think if they have that, it means that mainstream is any less relevant for them, because of course it's not. It's just an additional need. You can't ignore it. You just want to have the right things in place for those children if they have that additional need. And it can be hidden. And you probably all know this. It looks a bit different in children with Down syndrome. They might well have some learned pretend play and make eye contact and say hello and goodbye. They don't look so obviously as if they have autism as other learners, but they may have. And finding gross motor skills, right? And you can read that through as well. For teachers to know what they need to be doing. They need to be encouraging active movement and participation, but to know a little bit more about it as well. Now, this isn't finding gross motor skills. What I wanted to draw your attention to a new health series document we made with experts on the Down syndrome medical interest group last year. So it is up to date on neck instability, which teachers probably and parents should know about too. And I'm not going through this one either. We've got some resources on, visual motor skill foundations, except to say that it's the same as for other children. All of these things, that they're the same in development, and, fundamentally literacy and numeracy are the same. But we can still bring in knowledge about people with Down syndrome, but it's not totally different. It really isn't. So teachers are well placed to know how to go forward with things. And some children, this is a junior aged child who, is not yet cutting with scissors and is still learning to use a knife and fork, and so on. So, keeping going with visual motor skills for practical daily living and for drawing and writing. And if you're lucky, you've got an occupational therapist helping guide you through that. And this slide, I'll let you read it. I won't go through everything, but I've put it all together on one slide so you see just how many extra things may happen if you have Down syndrome, and why every child needs a comprehensive assessment that looks at all of those areas. Okay, so you can see those, and it isn't just hearing loss or delayed development, which of course would have an impact on speech and language and communication. There are lots of other things which are more specific, more likely if you have Down syndrome, and you need therapists who know about those and who look at those. Now, when I've said things are, roughly they're the same going forward in development, I know we're asking you to do that in an age-appropriate class, but there still are some things to know about literacy, about numeracy, about motor skill development, and I've just picked a couple to put for number because that's often left out. I put a few things there that I've taken from the education book from reference to. So of course, you can go on at different levels and learn more specifically about how to help. So we're coming to the end of the session on that background information about learning profile, and I put a summary slide in there about the strengths that summarizes what we've said. And I'm going to move on now to look at social inclusion. This slide highlights other things, so kind of an understanding of people's rights and needs, and I've put down friendships, I've put support for transitions across years and across stages of life, I've put down inclusive participation and the voice of children and young people who have Down syndrome, and making sure they really are included and ways for them to be included in everything. I've added in, for schools to understand that it's not just about now, it's for the whole future, and for work and community and well-being. And I've added in a line about understanding intellectual disability and individual needs. That's more aimed at secondary schools. Just sometimes I've found secondary schools, even though they've had all the reports and all the transition and all the work's gone on and they know this student, but when they write their end of term reports, they still seem to remind the parents that where the learner is in comparison with the people who don't have a learning disability. And that seems to me to be unkind and unnecessary. And if they really understood why that child was there and what having an intellectual disability is, they wouldn't do that. They'd just be focused on what they're doing and what they've been learning. It's very anyway, I won't say any more about that. I've put in some of the resources that we've made that are to encourage the voice of people, and one of them is just a couple of the pages here from the Listen to Me 3 to 11. These are all free downloads, and you'd have your own photos and pictures and sorting tasks and things to point to, even for people who may talk well, because if people become upset or are emotionally uncomfortable, they may not talk or tell you what's wrong. Okay. Now, this was Leave No One Behind was the World Down Syndrome Day theme from a few years ago, and we were really pushing there for inclusion for everybody, including children who have very complex needs, who are very a very much earlier stage in development than most learners who have Down syndrome. And that needs some thinking about, that's not for today, but we have done some thinking about that and really want to take that forward so that this is for them too. And then, of course, interaction with peers and working with parents closely on terminology and systems of communication and learning about health. This one is even to think about where they're sitting in the classroom, because that's vital for inclusion and for learning, for interaction with everybody, and for having and you've got to be in that class to have friends. And how are things set up? Are things set up for you to be as independent as possible? So wider thinking around it. This one and the next slide were some resources we made also on that theme, one for children up to about 10, 11, 3 sets of resources for teachers to work with classes about not leaving people out, not leaving people behind. And I've just selected a few little things there, but we've given them various activities to do and thought about it carefully as to how you might talk about Down syndrome anyway, we've also made one for young people with 3 resources, which are kind of 11 to 16, which include more information. Now to the bits I think probably you want to see some examples of some of the adjustments. But these are only just examples. It's going to be different for children at all different stages and ages. I think some of these are infants, many of them are junior, so 7 to 11. So what have we got here? Thinking about the equipment, the extra equipment you might need, and manipulatives. So, can you make some ready prepared things you can take out of a book and use on a desktop to support you in your learning? And they're on Velcro strips, and somebody could make lots of those for lots of learners in school, couldn't they? Have those ready-made manipulatives that are just standard manipulatives. Here you can see somebody's sign stuck up on the wall, and that's for somebody with a hearing aid, microphone. That's somebody with an adapted keyboard, independently getting on with her spelling practice with her adapted keyboard. And then, for some children, seating, and for many children have sloping desks, and in junior age range we'd see many having laptops and IT support. And big and bold, and even as simple as those black felt pens for writing. And of course, use of timetables and visual schedules, plenty of long ones, probably longer than these, I think, for some of them. And these are quite young children ones, as well as now and next and time-based, first, next and last, because that is a visual spatial grid and people can follow well a longer strip, not just a 2-part strip. This is... now we're thinking about the lesson, an actual delivery of a lesson and different parts of the lesson. And, lessons start with the teacher talking, a whole class presentation. And then there'll be various activities, and then there'll be review and feedback activities. And they might be all mixed up, not 1, 2, 3, quite like that. But we'd often see one of the issues that definitely needs visual supports is the whole class presentation. And for the younger child, that's often an assistant drawing on a whiteboard or passing things to them or showing them things that feed them, help them to attend back to the class teacher, not talking over the class teacher, because that won't develop their attention to follow the teacher. That will be co-teaching a lesson. So you can smile and sign and draw things or have copies of what the teacher's talking about to refer to. So infants, whiteboards and pens and pictures. This is a junior example, the record book here, and that's been made. It's not a record book for the child to write in, it's a listening book. So when they're doing a series of lessons on a topic, and that was literacy around the story of the Titanic, quite a few pages of the key pictures and people and characters, so that as she's listening at that whole class presentation, she can look at her book, or the assistant, if necessary, could point to one or cue her back in. But it's probably enough to just hold it herself, because she's got that to look at while she's listening. And then if you think of some of the activities in the class, I've picked some less common examples, but the first two were for an 8-year-old who had complex needs and autism, and he was very delayed compared to many children who have Down syndrome, and delightful. But you can't see very well in the picture, but it's a glittery gel bag. It's got glittery gel in it, which he liked. So, and he knew all his coins, and he knew his letters and his sounds. He knew some great things that had been done through these glittery gel bags. That's not usual that you would need to do that, but you can, can't you? If a child's needs are such, you can find ways of doing it, or having more pictures to stick into a book. And then the 3 examples along the bottom are very creative assistant work for somebody to engage them. You can see the learners helped to make the book. And you can see it's the story of the gingerbread man with nice pictures and text and close activities, cutting out the words to fill in the missing parts, and looking very engaging. This was a year 6 child who is doing very well with writing. So that's 10, 11. But to get to that point of having planned what she's going to write and thought about it, following whatever the teacher was asking them all to do, again, you've got engaging resources, colourful books, lift the flap charts, lift the flap bits of paper. They're very engaging, aren't they? Lift the flap things, pictures underneath them, and writing in speech bubbles to create what she wants to do. So making it more interesting. Now I've got more manipulatives here on these 2. That one's early vocabulary. These are not like before where they were general and that you could use them. They're specific to the series of lessons on a particular subject in science, and so the learner can take them out of the book and with some support can play extra games in addition to writing in his book or sticking things into his book or answering questions, and he can point and mix and match. So that takes some, that does need the teacher in her or his plans to have identified key vocabulary and got somebody to make those. And this is similar, again, for a whole series of lessons. People aren't doing this for just one lesson. They're doing it where there's a series of lessons. And this is literacy, study of a particular book that had some quite difficult words and ideas in to help support him in his learning. And that's a basic words for a writing folder. That's topic words, again, for a particular topic. For making up sentences and so on. Excuse me. And of course, visual supports and full records, things that children can stick into their books so they have nice records. They can revise themselves then and go through what they've done, pictures of them doing it, and good records. And to show their understanding, that's coin stickers to pop into a book for adding money. That's the same sort of thing for a simplified photosynthesis. Now that's year 7, that was just going into secondary school, but it was for a learner who was at that level. Some learners in year 7 wouldn't be at that level at all. They'd be writing themselves and at a much more advanced level, but I don't want to make any big thing about that. It is getting to know what's going to be useful for that learner and thinking about how to make every topic accessible. I put in a little bit about for ease in the classroom, making sure they've got their own things they're going to need in the lesson already prepared, so you're not having to go to different drawers and cupboards to find them. And again, I've just used number as an example of what you might have. So 2 sets of those numeral cards up to 20, 50, 100, whatever, so they can do matching games, dot cards for quantity and subitizing games, etc. A ruler, you might actually get an adapted ruler or adapt one yourself so that the lines, certainly the lining up line at the left-hand side, is clearer and you can easily see. So maybe issues there, and any other number of equipment you're using, and as you get a bit older, calculator. And then I've got an example now of somebody's coins folder to show you. This was actually somebody in secondary, but it could be anywhere. So this was his folder, and you can see that he has coins that have been covered in plastic on card, like they're file pages. So he could refer back to his folder to look up all the ways of making 6 or all the ways of making 20 when he's doing his work. And also he has adding money amounts in his folder. We want learners to be as independent as possible, and that's what a lot of these visual supports are for helping them to do, including memory aids and lists and schedules so they don't lose their place. And I've put in our 3-piece storyboard here. Again, storyboards are used by teachers, aren't they, commonly? But we made a 3-piece one because sometimes, 3 pieces is enough, especially if you want someone to work independently and start drawing their own pictures and writing their own information. But you can use them the other way too, with the teacher or the assistant putting in pictures, drawing pictures and giving instructions or ideas, or working with them to break down understanding of a text or a story about who were the characters, what happened in the end. So it's a visual spatial grid, isn't it, that you can use in lots of different ways. Making sure you can assess non-verbally, so ways for people to point or show or give you things to check if they've understood rather than relying on them answering questions verbally. And I'm looking at the time now. I've got a few writing examples as well, but you can read that slide. There are different ways of supporting writing, depending on where they are and what they like to do. But there's a whole range of ways that you can help them, including computer programs. I put in an example of that went with that Titanic story that I spoke about earlier. You can see this lovely picture here that at the end of this series of lessons, the student drew. You can see this ship, you can see there were some people on there, some people in the sea. That's a lifeboat with the rigging on the side there. And that learner had seen the film, the old black and white film where the ship sinks and the band plays. And it was a very difficult lesson, I would say, about the feelings of the band members as the ship sunk. But what I need you to know is that she was interested in the musical instruments and wondered where the trumpet was. And so that's what she's interested in, the instruments. And she wrote those herself there, the instruments. And why, or stick with that, why that was a particularly good. What happened is the assistant at the end of the lesson, when there was a very high level question and answering about these feelings of the band members, the assistant printed off some pictures of musical instruments with words underneath. And so she still sat with everybody and did cutting practice because she wasn't yet using scissors. Cutting practice was part of what she needed to do. And it was just so nice to work it in with what she'd already shown she was interested in and was already part of the lesson too. What does that need? Well, it needs a teacher and assistant working together, and it doesn't need access to a computer and a printer as well, doesn't it? Without having to go out of the room, just to be able to get that quickly off and to do that last 10 minutes of the lesson. I want to just give you some examples of progression here across that Titanic work, apart from the last one, just to show you where this child was. So that one there at the top is an example of doing the same work as everybody else in a previous lesson, but with support. So everybody's writing a letter, she's writing a letter. That one down there is doing it on the computer with clicker. That's another way of doing it. This one up here is her independent writing. So at that stage, she was given a picture, and that's her independent writing, which you would any teacher would recognise as emergent writing, unsupported, getting on with herself. That's her recording and mark making, and that, you know, that's great. You can see where that is. But what I wanted to show you that was that 2 years later, that was her writing independently, just to show what a long way, you know, how far she moved on. And there, that is with a 3-piece storyboard. She's writing about a personal experience, and they're often the easiest to write about when you're becoming an independent writer. And she drew a sequence of pictures and wrote down all of the words. And then with a bit of support, she could write that out. Anyway, just thought you might like to see the progression. And that's another example of a 3-piece storyboard with somebody's independent writing and pictures for a story. And that's another one. It's you know, having drawn the pictures for the first, next, last, and focusing on the time words of organising that story information. Now, I've put in a couple of thinking slides here. You know, I know we've said right at the beginning that planning is the teacher's job, and the teacher with the assistant, and for the bigger, longer term planning, including parents in that, who is going to make and print extra resources, who's going to make manipulatives. I've put down in brackets what I find very helpful still is a packet of felt pens and pre-cut strips or squares of thick paper or card, so that you can draw things and make manipulatives without having to get them ready in advance. And they can do them too. So still low tech, very useful, I'd say. And home support and coordination, you know, what are you going to give as homework and how are you going to talk about that? I'd suggest guidance for parents who will want to know what's being covered, of course, but to try and make links with that and do things for real, rather than sitting a child down to do what's been done in class again, wherever you can. So if you knew that a story about going to the vet had been covered, I'm thinking in normal times, not COVID times really, but you know, that would be really helpful, wouldn't it, to go and visit a vet and make that real and make real links with what's going on at school, and for schools to share that with that in mind. This came from reference to as well, and it was written for number, but I think it applies to anything. And it's really good advice for teachers. You know, you follow the regular program. What adaptations can you make to help the learner? Measure success, not failure. Really focus on recording and measuring and marking the success. Encourage problem solving, persistence, consider motor skills, consider practice right across the curriculum, and think about preparation and working together. That takes me to 2 last slides. One, and we haven't got much time, have we? But if you wanted, or in questions, to talk about the role of the teaching assistant, because I understand it is very different, and in some countries it's restricted as to what you can do. It isn't really restricted here. And, you know, helping people to be independent, I'd put right up at the top. I put not too much talking down at the bottom, just so that children have time to think and to concentrate and to do things, because you can have too much assistance, too much talking going on. So get away with them, get away from them whenever they're set up to do it on their own. But, you know, that might be something for another time for EDSA to look at that. And then just as a final thought, I just wanted to let you know that we make accessible resources at the DSA on any topic, on any information, bit of information, not for schools, but for just on any topic. And you've probably seen some of those, and we make those with people with Down syndrome. But our clever comms team have made them super easy for us, so that there are templates and you can just drop pictures in the right size and it'll come up the right size text. And they've set them up for us with all different sizes and options, so you can have 2-piece or 6-piece and fact sheet pieces. And I just thought, wouldn't that be fun if schools set their own school template, so that people, especially as they got a little bit older, they could do their recording on it and show what they've understood. Or teachers could make their own accessible information for the key points of lessons or series of lessons that they're teaching them, and drop them onto their own school kind of templates. I'm sure that perhaps they already do all of that. It'd be easy for teachers to do that, I think, or an IT department in any school to set that up. So that was just a last thought, really, that we have all sorts set up to make it easy for the non-techie people in our team to easily make accessible information with people with Down syndrome. Right, I haven't looked at any of the chat, but I have come to questions now.
Yeah, Gillian, thanks a lot. In the questions, we don't have, in chat, we have just few comments. So we had more problem with the interest of the people who were over the 100, and how this Turkey help us, and we have possibility over 100. It was mostly in the chat. I'm sorry, during the sometime. We don't have, I could say, so many comments. Okay. Just few comments from Professor Stanjic from Croatia. But if somebody has some more questions, please let's write, or maybe if somebody would like to say something, Mary will open and unmute your phone. Do anybody has some question that would like to speak up?
You don't have to ask questions. We've nearly run out of time anyway. But I hope it went through some, it gave some practical examples. I hope you found it interesting. And it's given you, perhaps some ideas. Yeah. What other comments could I make? Sometimes, we do work with schools. Many primary schools in the UK have got this. They know how to do this for most children with Down syndrome. It will be varied. But where they're not seeing how they can easily do it is with children who have bigger and more complex needs. So some of our work is with those heads and those teachers to say, to talk it through a bit more and say, well, you can differentiate this, and this is how you could do it. And this is fine. This is fine. For that learner, that is fine to go right down to an easier, just how to do it for everybody. And I've picked examples. I haven't picked examples of very able people. It should be even easier for them, shouldn't it? To make things just a bit easier for them, or a bit less, or a bit something. Yeah, just to make those adjustments even more easily for them.
Gillian, during your experience and work with the children with Down syndrome and school inclusion, what was the main problem, what you saw during this your work, and also especially when you start in UK with inclusion in the school with children with Down syndrome? What was biggest problem or obstacles?
Yeah.
Were they teachers, schools, directors, or families? Or
well, not families. They're fine. I think people understanding what it is they're doing, you know, getting over this idea that the children have to be able to do certain things or keep up, or it's going to get more difficult and you stop doing it when they're, you know, a certain amount behind. So it's really getting, it's back to those things right at the beginning of the presentation. It's not the detail, it's the big ideas about why they're there and what it is their job to do.
How was with regulation in UK regarding the school inclusion? Because we have in so many countries situation that it's not so easy to change the regulation, laws, and such. How to do that? What you suggest? What is the best way?
To change laws? Oh, yeah. I think that might be a question for everybody to talk about with, you know, with it based on those education guidelines with Down Syndrome International. I think the law is pretty good here in the UK, and I guess that has happened, you know, that happened so long ago that I've probably forgotten about it. It happened a long time ago, but I wouldn't say, you know, that inclusion is perfect still. There's still a lot, you know, there are still recurring themes of recurring problems. Now, as an association, we probably hear a lot of the problems because people and schools and parents will be contacting us when things aren't going so well. You know, silly things like people thinking when they get to year 2, it's all getting a bit difficult now. Year 2's 5, 6, 7. And maybe, you know, maybe that's time to move to a special school, which is, you know, 30 years old, that idea. But it still seems to come back in until we've got it into teacher training and, you know, back to those guidelines for leaders and guidelines for teacher training. Also, I think we can sometimes hear a bit of a negative viewpoint, which is why I'm really looking forward to Sarah Geiger's research webinar and when she gets her research published, because I think there may be some more positives. That we're not.
Yeah, we have some more questions. Gillian, we have some more questions. We open with this question that people are asking. Okay, Sanya from Bosnia and Herzegovina asked something similar, like I asked you. She asked, are there any, we hope to get some kind of the set of the standards in the form of strong recommendation in order to make our authorities to be more educated about inclusion. You know, how to prepare inputs for the governments, really with recommendation, what they have to do and how they have to do. That's in the line what we just you talk how was in UK. But in the next question or next comment, it is from Natalia Woznuk. It's how to define the level of inclusion, which is optimal for child in the term of time in class and also in type of activities. Are there any guidelines?
There can't be, because every child is different, I think, is the answer to that. And that back to the first question, that those international guidelines are very, very clear and very evidence-based. So if you're taking those to a government, they're absolutely there, you know, as was Alana, but they're absolutely there for that. You know, we would say what I said earlier, that we'd want children in class as much of the time as they can be, but it would really depend on their needs. I mean, one is, I said about the children who with attention issues who aren't yet sitting for very long, or who need learning breaks, who need to go out from it or come in, you know, they need those breaks. It would be based on needs. It would be considered very poor practice to have a child out of class for as much as half of their time. But I'm reluctant to even say the figure half, because that might give the idea that it's okay to have them out lots and lots. And, you know, it isn't really. But you can go out to do, or you can certainly have some focused work. So no, you can't come out with a firm guideline on that. depends on
people. Thanks, Gillian. We have one nice comment also from the EDSA Facebook site. Ladies learning support teacher and working online with children, with students, and she's pleased with all your guidelines, what you present today. Thanks a lot in her name as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we have several questions because people are very interested in your presentation, and even they're asking, are there any possibility they get, and also they would like to translate in their own language, because a situation it is that there are not so many people who are interesting, but they don't know English. Yeah. And it's a problem. They would like to translate in their own language. Are there any possibility that your presentation, give to them and then translate it into language what they want, or maybe we could arrange something else?
Yeah, I think there are possibilities there. I'm thinking there might be another way to do it, but yes, there are possibilities there. Perhaps we can talk about it afterwards.
Okay.
And people are welcome to email me at the Down Syndrome Association. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm thinking, well, there's these slides. I don't know how standalone they would be, just as slides. I'm not sure. But there's also work with that I'm involved in with Down Syndrome International about making toolkits and making ways of giving more practical examples with those guidelines. And those are going to be translated, I believe, and working with organisations to be translated. Anyway, I don't want to go off too much, but there might be all sorts of possibilities.
Yeah, okay. Just comment to all who ask for presentation. After this webinar, we will talk together with Down Syndrome Association and see how EDSA and the Down Syndrome Association could arrange some things about this presentation in other languages.
Yeah.
Does anybody has more questions? No, at the moment. Okay, we have one question from Slovakia. Okay. I would like to know your opinion on the following. Would you rather have the children with Down syndrome in the normal school with special assistant teacher support, or have Down syndrome kids in the school for the kids with special needs?
All of this has been about children in mainstream schools. Now, for meeting need, so yes, I'd rather have that. Yes. But for meeting needs, the needs we've talked about here apply to all children everywhere with Down syndrome. So if you were in a specialised setting, you could still do the things we've been talking about. Of course you can. But we're wanting people to be doing those in ordinary schools.
Yeah. Another question is, does teacher education in the UK include theoretical and practical information about how to teach a child with Down syndrome?
Well, we run some online training and we're developing that at the moment with a series of modules, but I think it would be, if you're looking at kind of proper teacher training, it would be going through an academic course. It would be continuing professional development, and many of those things that are in those guidelines, and coming up with accredited courses and professional qualifications. I'm pushing the guidelines. That's in the guidelines too, as to what people should be looking at for that. But yeah, we definitely give training to people, but possibly not what you're asking about.
Okay, let's see. Everybody said it's excellent. Thanks a lot, Gillian. Okay, it's a question that is now a general question. Does the Down Syndrome Association provide any support information for special assistant teacher? Okay, like example, like your Down Syndrome Association Do you have any support information for special teaching a teacher? That's a question.
I'm not sure quite what it means.
Yes,
yes.
I'm not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because special assistant teacher, we are not using in this area.
Yeah, and if you were, and really, you know, the content that I've said applies whether you're a specialist teacher or a non-specialist teacher, and whether you're in a mainstream school or a special school, really. So, yeah. We don't provide advanced level academic training for, you know, like university type qualifications. No, we don't provide that, but we would like other people to, and to feed into that.
Yes, maybe only Olesa Pakhomova maybe explain a little bit more what you think. Yeah.
Yeah, I will go back to, though, that the things that those recommendations, you know, you can learn, well, I've covered most of it. Each of those points you could learn about in a lot more depth and follow up the references on each of those points, but you would still come back to those points. You cannot, you know, every learner with Down syndrome is different. And those principles of they're in the class they're in and taking what they're learning about with everybody else and making it accessible to them as an individual, and that'll be very different because we have people at so many different stages. That is what you do, rather than a theoretical, this is what you do with a person with Down syndrome. And learning literacy is learning literacy, and learning numeracy is learning numeracy, and learning science is science, and maths, you know, it's not that different.
Yes. Okay, we don't have a more question at the moment. Just more thanks for the presentation.
Hello, Amy. Thank you. Hello to everybody. I've seen lots of familiar faces. It's been very nice. Thank you. And names. Thank you.
Yes, it is. Still, we are more than 80 connected. Okay, mostly. Okay, we should try to include new ideas in our lessons with children. Yes, true. We have some teachers here from Slovakia, from Moscow.
Oh, thank you for joining.
Yes, that's nice for them. Okay. Mostly now. Thanks to everybody. Thanks first to you, and also thanks to all of you who stay with us this 1 hour and 50 minutes. And still, some people are getting in and out, dependent on what is about the connections. Really thanks a lot from most countries in Europe, what we have at the moment. If nobody has more questions, I would like to conclude and say big thanks to Gillian for today's presentation, and a very important part for us and for our children, how to go to school, how to spend the best time in the school, and how to learn in the school, on which way we could learn in the school, and also how we could learn at home.